Welcome to the Future of Work, the series where we're looking in depth at what can be done now to ensure that all independent workers thrive in the years ahead. I'm Pete Lyde, I'm the founder of Reinvent, the media company that's driving the conversation here. We're doing it in partnership with Intuit, who also has a really interesting kind of stake essentially in the outcome of driving more innovation in the space around independent workers. And with today, we've got Roy Bahat with us for a deep dive conversation. Roy is the head of Bloomberg Beta, which is a venture fund that invests in businesses that kind of make businesses work better, maybe is one way to frame it.
Invest in the future work.
And then we also, he was also the co-chair of the Shift Commission on Work, Workers, and Technology, which is a really, a big deal in the space of future work, really kind of drove some new thinking, particularly around a set of scenarios of where the world could go in the coming years around these big disruptions in the workspace. Great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So before we jump into the commission work, which I really want to get into in depth, your day job.
Yes. I sling money.
You sling money, but you've been doing an increasing amount of slinging money in companies that are trying to work on AI, and that's a big driver of this conversation. But say a little bit more about what you're doing with that fund and what you're seeing out there.
You know, our fund's relatively new as a venture fund goes. It's 4.5 years old, which makes us a baby. And we started out on day one focused on the same thing we're focused on now, which is the future work. And our high level view was, you know, our family lives have been changed, our school, personal lives have been changed by technology, and work changed a lot less over the course of the last 10 or 20 years. And our view was that work would catch up and that it'd be completely transformed. And the surprise for us was we saw in the very beginning artificial intelligence as a technology that was far off, you know, not quite teleportation, but far off. And then about a year into the fund, one of my partners came to me and she said, "Oh, I think it's happening now. We should look at it." And I said, "I think you're crazy, but if you want to spend your time on it, be my guest." And she started researching it. And then, I don't know, a few months later, I looked at the work she'd done. She'd looked at 2,000 AI companies, and I just completely swallowed my words and realized that the future is here now. And AI has been rare among tech movements because in tech, and you know, you've seen these trends to know, we always have these things that are just a few years away. Like I remember for a decade, the mobile internet was 2 years away, and every year it was 2 years away, and it kept receding kind of into the distance as you got closer to it. With AI, not only is that not happening, the opposite is happening, which is that you have the technologists who are working on this stuff saying, well, the year that we'll be able to achieve a level X autonomous vehicle is, you know, this year. And then a year will pass, and not only will the estimate be there, it'll get closer. And that feeling of the future kind of coming in toward us more rapidly is something that's happening in artificial intelligence in a way that, you know, that I haven't seen in another technology trend. So that's why, for us, it's been the main technology area that we've cared about for the last 3 or so years.
Really? So it went from not really tuning into it to now it's the
a zero to being the principal kind of method that we think is going to transform the future of work. That's right.
Well, say a little bit more about this, because I know Kevin Kelly, who we both know, and Kevin opened my brain up into that a while, and he just said basically the next 10,000 startups are going to be take AI and apply it to everything.
Yeah.
I mean, is that something you share?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about
the way
your
I think
version
of it
and how
is
you
this.
think about it.
You know, AI is like, what is AI? It's a class of techniques that allow you to predict using software. And some of those techniques have been around for a very, very, very long time. I mean, a simple economist's regression, where you take a bunch of data points and try to draw a line through them, is a predictive technique. If you think about that, the value of using software to predict something, how big a trend is it? Well, it's at least as big a trend as the mobile internet. There's no question in my mind. It's at least as big a trend as the internet as a whole. Because if you think about what the internet does as software, it reduces the cost of communicating between people. But communication is only one of the things that we do with one another. All of the other things we do could be affected by the ability to anticipate the future. And so there's a chance that AI is as big as all of software to date. And so if there is still a possibility of that, then of course, you know, it is going to become so ubiquitous that we're not even going to see it anymore, and it's going to be boring. I mean, Kevin Kelly says it's going to be like electricity, and I think that is precisely the right way to think about it.
You do. Now, just lay it out for people that might not be as aware of that. Meaning, it's essentially going to be in the cloud for everybody to use well, not everybody, but people without AI expertise to be able to apply that kind of AI to different niches of business opportunities. Is that what you think?
It'll be in the cloud, but it'll also be locally on your device. It'll also be embedded in all kinds of things. Anything that has a chip in it is going to have some ability to predict in it. And so just think about the business opportunities. You go home, use a smart lock. If the smart lock knows you're about to come home, it might be a little more ready and might work a little faster than otherwise. If you are a doctor and you're trying to decide whether or not to make a diagnosis, anticipating what the patient's likely outcomes will be is enormously valuable. And so I really think everywhere is the right way to think about it. And a lot of people have said data is the new oil, which I think is also a great way to think about it, because oil, but hopefully other things too, create electricity. And then what you have is you have this useful tool that can help you make everything around you function somewhat better.
Now, one of the little pieces that struck me when you just said that, just to clarify a little bit, why do you think it's actually going fast, is coming closer rather than receding? Because I think your observation is true that so many of these things, we're always waiting for cold fusion and those big things and those things, but this thing is or even closer things, like you say. What do you think is happening? Is it just that so many brains are on it? It's
The honest answer is I don't know.
Okay, you don't know.
I mean, if you ask the technologists, some of them will say, well, there were just a few breakthroughs where if you look at one benchmark, which is image recognition, there was an annual contest, ImageNet, and then there was just this year where all of a sudden the accuracy of the computer in classifying images and recognizing them just shot up. And my personal take is some of it might be that we overcorrected for how disappointed we were in AI. There was this period called the AI winter when the US basically stopped, US educational institutions, the US government more or less stopped looking at AI. Canada kept going, by the way, which is one of the reasons why Toronto and other Canadian cities are hotbeds of AI activity. And we just said, you know what, there's nothing there as an industry. And what might just be happening now is we're waking up to realize actually we overcorrected. And then what starts to happen is these things have a self-fulfilling prophecy where more of the smartest minds are drawn to working on AI problems because they believe there's something there, and then of course they then make progress faster. So I think that might be driving it, is it's a correction for a few decades of underestimating ourselves.
Now, can you give someone a more concrete sense, maybe using the companies you have, what are some examples of companies that you're invested in or you're aware of that are just doing cool things that people wouldn't have thought of?
Yeah, I mean, look, Google is the canonical example because what they're predicting, one simple thing, not simple to do, but simple to describe, thing they're predicting is which of these links are you going to click on? And they just want to give you the link that you're most likely to click on. In a more practical business sense, I'll give you an example. A company we invested in called Textio that is a word processor. And you remember that feeling you got the first time a word processor gave a wavy red line underneath something and said, how did it know? I misspelled that word. This is like that, except it predicts what the results of those words are going to be. So for example, job descriptions, which is where they started, it'll underline a word or highlight a word more beautifully than an underline and say, change this, and you'll get more diverse applicants. A more diverse pool of applicants, or you'll just get better quality applicants. And so
they'll give you the options of what to choose.
They'll give you some recommendations or ways of thinking about it. And so a word processor that predicts the future of what the result is going to be is a totally different way of thinking about our own tools. And then what then happens, by the way, is that the writer then starts to expect, well, how can I possibly write something without knowing what its consequence, what its result is going to be? Another example of a company that we've invested in is a physical security company called Cobalt Robotics. So Cobalt has a robot, and it anticipates where it should walk. Basically, where would a human being walk if it had to walk around an office in order to patrol the office? And then it tries to anticipate and say, oh, this thing that I just saw, what's the likelihood that that's a bad guy? And if it thinks there's a chance it's a bad guy, then a human being takes over, looks through the robot's eyes, decides what to do, communicates, etc. So it doesn't necessarily, one of the myths about AI is that it all has to be fully autonomous, fully automatic. It doesn't. It just has to rate the likelihood that something might be worth looking at, and then a human being can intervene and apply human judgment.
Well, in fact, both those examples you gave are just augmenting humans, really, making it. So is that where more of your...
I think that's a fairy tale.
Okay.
So there's this, one of the worries that happens when technology starts to get developed is technologists love to think ad infinitum. So they say, okay, AI is automating some things. Uh-oh, what happens if everything gets automated? Whoa, 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 none of us will have a job. And that's scary. Who knows when that happens, if it happens, et cetera. But that's a fear that's out there. And then people start to debate about that hypothetical fear. And a lot of people say, well, it's not actually going to replace us. It's going to augment us. It's going to complement us. And I personally think that that is a nonsense way of looking at it, because anything that complements us replaces some things we do. Will it replace us human beings in our entirety? Of course not, because we're going to still live and be here and have wants and needs and aspirations. And so as long as we have wants and needs and aspirations, we'll continue trying to do the best things that we can. And so I think this whole like, will we be complemented or replaced is sort of a nonsense way of looking at the problem. It just makes us feel better because it makes us feel like superhumans, which AI does make us feel like superhumans. I mean, when I write a job description and I can edit it in a way where I know what the future might hold, I feel powerful. But that doesn't actually change what effect it might have on the availability of employment, on, if you make a worker 10 times more productive, will there be as many workers making 10 times more? Or will there be 1/10 as many workers making the same amount? It could happen either way. One isn't necessarily, the immediate and obvious consequence.
Okay, so now we're moving into the future work here.
Yeah.
So AI is either freaking some people out. There's all these things, but your feeling, knowing what that world's like, seeing all the energy, all the kind of excitement about it, but also understanding its limitations. How do you see that as like one of the most important drivers of reshaping the future work?
No question. It is going to be one of the central drivers for one specific reason. It's so hard to imagine what it will do. I remember I got offered a job writing HTML in 1994 for like a little software consulting thing in New York. And I looked at what was then the internet, and the browser that I used was NCSA Mosaic. And I looked, and you were smarter than I was, because I looked at that page with the blue links, and I was like, what is this going to be useful for? And I effectively said to myself, it's not that interesting. And when I asked the people working on it, I asked them, what will this be useful for? All the examples they could give me were pretty dumb. And so they didn't excite me either. And that's the thing, when you have some of these technologies, you can't imagine exactly what will happen. And that's why the most interesting thing is just to see people messing around with it. And so, and just to give you an example, I said you can feel like a superhuman when you deploy some of these technologies. And by the way, every time in my Google Smart inbox, it recommends one of 3 replies, and one of them, Smart Reply, and one of them sounds like me. I just think, wow, that's amazing that just happened. The people in the working world who I see experimenting the most aggressively with how to become superhuman as a result of AI are the founders of companies. And it's one of the reasons it's so fun to work with them is, a limiting constraint in the progress of the economy, I believe, is what independent workers, including the founders of companies, do with their independence. And if they can become superpowered, they can accomplish a lot more. So it's just really exciting to look at it in that vein. I know that wasn't exactly your question, but I felt like I had to say that.
That's you hit on it. So we're talking about the future of independent workers in particular. So weirdly, you were pointing out that there's a lot of positive possibilities of AI augmenting at some level an independent worker. And we've talked about this in other conversations about why couldn't AI help an independent worker get more consistent, steady work and fill in the gaps where they don't know where to look for work, and AI says, hey, there's a great job down there.
Yeah.
I mean, talk a little bit about the positive side as well as the negative side on the independent worker.
Sure. I mean, like anything that's a profound change, it brings both positives and negatives, and the whole question is how you manage it. This commission that we did for a year with New America, the Shift Commission, was an attempt to try to grapple with how do we sort all that out. So, first of all, AI, just to the extent it gives you better tools, can enable an independent worker to compete with a much bigger firm and to do the work that otherwise would have required many more people because they can be much more productive. If, for example, they don't need to spend as much time scheduling their own meetings to pick something difficult but trivial to imagine, difficult to do but trivial to imagine, well, then all of a sudden they can spend more of their time with clients, or they can spend more of their time doing graphic design or software engineering or whatever it is that they do. So that is the positive side, that it can make the market more efficient, help people find opportunities, that it can create advantages for them compared to big firms. And by the way, as an aside, an interesting thing we see there is many, many small firms and individuals capable of doing things that previously only big companies could do.
Completely.
The negative side is that it will affect the demand for all kinds of different work. And if you are doing something for which it turns out a computer is a better way to solve the problem than having an independent worker or any worker, an employed person, a part-time person, a contractor, however you want to look at it, do it, you're going to be in trouble. And that's a problem that we as a society and as an economy, but more importantly as a society, that we have to grapple with.
Totally get it, and let's get there. Now, so you mentioned the Shift Commission. I said it at the beginning here, but give us a sense, because we really haven't had someone to really go deep on the Shift Commission.
Sure.
Tell us the origins of that whole thing and what that effort was about and,
Sure.
and what you did.
I mean, it started for me from a very personal problem, which is I'm investing in all these companies that are affecting the future work. And then when I think about what's the world going to look like into which they exist, how do they thrive, how does the society work, I don't have a picture in my head. And so I started out going to conferences about the future work, because there was this one year, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where it felt like every conference was about the future work. Mm-hmm. And I started reading stuff, and I figured somebody must know. I'll just find whoever's smart about this and ask them, and then I'll learn from them. And then I realized every conference is the same conversations. Every book is going over the same material for the most part. There's obviously some great work that's been done, but nobody has the answers. And some other colleagues at Bloomberg were having the same issues on the technical side, looking at the implications of actually doing AI. And then we got to know New America, and just by chance, New America was thinking about these issues from a public policy and a societal perspective. And we shared the common dilemma of not knowing what the picture of the future might look like that we were planning for, feeling like there were fake debates happening all around us, people debating over whether 90% of jobs or 40% of tasks would be eliminated. By what year, I have no idea. All these debates where if you asked, why does the answer to this question matter, it wasn't clear. And we also faced the problem that many of the communities working on these issues, economists, technologists, arts and culture leaders, political leaders, policy thinkers, journalists, just didn't talk to each other all that much about it. And so they were sort of speaking past each other. And so, I'm sure you see that all the time.
Exactly, the cross connection is half the job here.
And so we asked ourselves, could we set up a project that would help us develop a picture of what the future work might look like, even though we know we can't predict it, just to help us understand what it might look like. And could we, at the same time, bring some of these communities together? And the Shift Commission was our answer to that question. And fortunately, and you know this from having done scenario planning work, there's a technique for how do you plan and prepare when you can't have an accurate prediction for what will happen. And that technique is to imagine different scenarios and compare and contrast them. Mm-hmm. And so we put a group of more than 100 American leaders in every walk of life, right and left on the political spectrum, old and young, as diverse a group of leaders as we could. We had to meet in 5 different cities across the US, and went through this exercise of imagining different scenarios and then consolidating them into one unified picture of what the future might look like. And that was the Shift Commission.
Fascinating. Now, one of the things we know about scenarios is that you also start thinking about what are the driving forces, what are the kind of certainties that are going to be out there. Now, one of them is this AI, but talk about some of the other biggies that you see as really defining the coming years.
Yeah, the interesting thing about AI, by the way, is we assumed going into it that we would have no view on predicting what would happen. So we treated it as very uncertain. And then you look at the forces that are driving certainties, and all of a sudden, those seem to take on a much greater importance in your mind, and they're things that we tend to ignore because as human beings, if something is just happening and there's not a lot of change day to day, we're invisible to it. It's the frog in a pot of boiling water thing. The single biggest one is the aging of the population. It makes me crazy when I go and talk to people and they say, oh, the future of work is young people. It's millennials. And of course that's true, because young people are going to be older and they're going to be around in the future. But if you look at the composition of the workforce as a whole, it's going to be much more important as a society for us to figure out what to do. And this is our work was very US focused, so that's an acknowledged limitation of it. But at least in the US, and in many other countries that happen to also be going through similar demographic transitions, the workforce is going to get older. Double the proportion of workers 55 and older. I mean, that is I'm prepared to bank on that. And we don't have good answers for it. We don't know what an intergenerational workforce really should look like. We don't know what it looks like when models of career development are affected by the fact that the people who would have retired just want to keep working because they're healthy and smart or they have to. And then, of course, you also get to the issue, so that's the other side of it, is that many of the most negative effects of the advance of technology, whether it's the elimination of routine forms of work or the accelerating pace of change in the skills that workers need to have, are going to hit older populations much, much harder. And so they'll both be greater ability to work and arguably much greater need. And so this whole question of independent workers, to me, the first place, when you say independent worker, a lot of people imagine the person who's, driving for a task, for a car sharing service in the morning and selling something on Etsy in the afternoon kind of a thing. I don't imagine that. I imagine somebody age 55 or older who has been in a stable profession for a long time, who, whether because of need or because of desire, wants to do something else, and how does that person productively spend his or her time? And there are some bedeviling problems. One is just classical employment, like where do you find jobs or work to do? Another is that the society, we have work that needs to get done for which there isn't a willing payer. I mean, for example, elder care. Yeah. There are plenty of people who, whether they're healthy and working or not, still need some assistance. Yep. And the wage available for that work is not satisfying the demand for how much help people want. And by the way, not all those people want to be helped by somebody they pay. And so we have this weird non-economic aspect of the future of work. Not weird. We have a non-economic aspect of the future of work that's always been sitting there, but invisible to modern economics, which is the unpaid economy. And so we, as part of our Shift Commission work, we did focus groups with people who, in addition to their jobs, do some elder care for a relative usually. And we said, well, would you want to pay somebody to do this? They said very understandable things like, my uncle doesn't want some random person coming into his house to help him. He wants me. And we do not have a way of seeing that through the lens of GDP and paid work. And this is something that mothers have known for generations. And that I think the rest of the economy has got to face up to. It is one of the biggest issues we have in our modern understanding of the future of work is what do you do about unpaid work? Because, I mean, even just calling it that, by the way, makes it sound, people call it care work sometimes, which I think is also too limiting. We don't even have a name for this sphere of human activity that's necessary but not economically counting.
Totally fascinating. But it is the space that when you do think of a future of much more automated routine tasks could liberate creative, warm, emotional human beings.
No question.
To do that.
Of course.
Assuming it was paid in a way that was
or that their lives worked in some other way, which is why so many people think about universal basic income. But a great film on this, if you haven't seen it, is Robot and Frank. So everybody's seen the AI, well, not everybody, but a lot of people have seen the AI bad guy movies. Ex Machina, it's like Robot Gone Wild,
yes,
we'll go. This movie is about a guy who actually was an ex-con, and he's aging and starting to suffer from dementia, and his family buys him a home health care robot, and it's set in the near future, and it's about the relationship between him and this home health care aid robot, and there's a lot to learn there about how we ought to think about these things.
Oh, I'm definitely going to watch
Yeah,
that.
it's a good one.
Is it like a full feature film?
Yeah, Frank Langella, great indie flick. We actually had the director in to come and the writer in to come talk to our founders, because one of the things that we do with the early stage companies that we work with, they're rightfully so, they're just focused on their business not dying. Yeah. And so one of the things we can do as their backers, we can say, hey, we took a little time and we invited in somebody who has a perspective on issues you care about, but from a totally different walk of life. So sometimes it's a political leader, sometimes, it's the kind of people who you frankly interview all the time, present company notwithstanding. And so, we had the creators of that film in to talk to our founders, and it was a great conversation.
Fantastic. We're given, even though we have a deep dive space here, let's keep moving to some of the other ones. So aging, awesome.
Yep.
You mentioned this shift to non-work income, which is our kind of
There's two shifts.
There's two shifts. Yeah,
I mentioned the shift to non-income work. There is also the shift to non-work income, meaning the percentage of dollars, now we're talking about dollars, that land in a person's bank account that come from work, from deploying their time and effort to do something is declining. And it's declining for two reasons. One is payments from the government, so Social Security being a bigger proportion, for example. And the other is assets, is people who own real estate or something else that produces income for them that is not work-related income. And so we think of work still as the main way that, since the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, it's like work hard, get paid, ... It's a decreasing proportion of the economic lives of the average kind of families.
Well, I was struck by you describe to people who can't see these, but I was struck by what is the percentage it used to be and what is the percentage now that it's actually gotten to?
So hold on, I will give me that for a second. So in 1950, it was roughly 65%, and
65%
of income came from working, and in 2015, it's roughly 50%.
So that's an astounding stat.
It's an astounding shift. It is really remarkable. And it has to do, that's also related to the aging population, but it's also related to capital being, it's related to the concentration of wealth at the top of the economy.
But now, given that we've been working with the future work, we also have a big project on the future of the sharing economy. How much of that would the 50% that an Airbnb host gets to supplement their income, would that be on the 50%
That's
non-work?
not work. That's not work.
So but it's yet the sharing economy.
Yeah, look, and it is, that's right, it's the sharing economy, and these things are all strange to define because, I was an Airbnb host. In fact, I was an Airbnb super host. That's mostly my wife, who was better at it than I was, but we worked. Like when you're answering those questions from a renter who's upset because the Wi-Fi went down, that's a job. In fact, one of the reasons we stopped doing it is because I thought to myself, we already have jobs. Like, what do we need this other job? And so, but nonetheless, we're fortunate to be able to do that because we own real estate that we were able to rent out. And so that is a factor here, is that the concentration of assets is only in one portion of the population.
Right. So, but when we talk about the gig economy, 1099 world, that's still counted in the portion of work?
That's work.
Okay,
the 1099
so
world is work. Okay. Absolutely. Okay. That is still work.
Okay. So, and then just with the other thing that was striking, just from because we're trying to figure out the future here, the declining dynamism of the economy.
Yeah.
Talk about that, because we're talking about it here. We're in San Francisco. The kind of
it's like people are switching jobs every 2 days. Yeah,
but explain. Slow down and explain. Yeah. What's going on in the rest of the country?
So there is a myth that the economy is accelerating, that people are moving jobs faster and faster, that things are happening faster than they once did. The opposite is true, which is to say, the rate at which, there's a few different measures of this, the rate at which people move long distances, steadily declining. The rate at which people switch jobs, not increasing.
That is wild.
Not increasing. And just because it's the experience of a handful of people who you happen to know, who we happen to know, doesn't make it true. And I think that part of the issue with inequality in American society is that leaders in American society used to have a much better ability to empathize with everybody else because their lives were much more similar to everybody else. And now we live in this world where you might see people around you, somebody graduating from college and, doing part-time work here and there and then switching jobs every 2 years. That's great, but that is not the lived experience of the typical American person. And, another measure is the rate of creation of new businesses. The rate of creation of new businesses continues to decline. We have a much less entrepreneurial society in the United States than we used to have by that measure. And so you look across all these different things and what you see is technology that's speeding up and an economy whose rate of change is slowing down.
And what do you make of that?
I call it the impending great American disappointment, which is that we have all these views that we were taught in school, like work hard, get a job, everything's gonna basically work out all right. That's kind of the fundamental American idea about economic life. It's not clear that that's true for a typical person. You can work hard, you can go to school. Typical person doesn't go to college, but even if you go to college, it's not necessarily true that everything will be fine and you'll be able to provide. So that's one. Another one is how people's kids are treated. As a parent of young kids, I think about this. We now live, so a very typical thing is I'm gonna work hard and then my kids are gonna be better off than I am. We now live in the first generation in the United States where kids are statistically likely to earn less than their parents. And that's terrifying. We don't know how to deal with that. And so I think we have this case where we have all these expectations that are largely driven by this period after World War II of unusual economic stability and unusual growth, where we're going to have to reckon with a much more difficult environment.
And then the other one, just to put out there that we have explored, but I just do want to touch on it, is this geographic gap. Give any particular insights you want to lay out on that?
Only that, people talk about inequality. They usually talk about inequality between people, well, the rich versus the poor, but it's also inequality between companies. Rich companies are getting richer compared to poor companies. It's also inequality between places. The top 10% richest cities are pulling away from the pack. The US is no longer, the ratio of people who live inside and outside of cities is now pretty stable in the United States, but the economic success of the best off cities is pulling away from the pack. And that's good news in the sense that those cities do well. It's also bad news in the sense that people can't afford to live in those cities. I mean, it's something we certainly see right here in San Francisco. And so that inequality is playing out geographically. You then add onto that the overlay of fewer people moving. And then you think, well, what if people are stuck in places, which is clearly what's happening. They're stuck in places where they don't have the opportunities that they want. Good news on this is I see independent workers as part of the antidote, which is if you can set up an environment where an independent worker feels they are stable and supported, and we can talk about stability in a second, then they might be able to do their work remotely. They might be able to create economic opportunity for themselves. I mean, independence, entrepreneurialism, those are the only jobs from which you can't be fired. And so maybe the greater independence of the American workforce, again, we have to support it, figure out ways to provide benefits and all that stuff, could be the antidote to a lot of these issues.
Well, and we did a fascinating roundtable on this with a lot of tech folks who are now going into the heartland and actually connecting up interesting companies that are tapping into all kinds of independent workers. But the one thing that I think we also, again, is the technology is enabling this in a way that it previously couldn't. I mean, video conferencing now is routine and all the kind of stuff. We know all these productivity tools that you can kind of stay connected. So anyhow, there's some hope there as well. So just in keeping with what is a really big conversation here, so we've talked about some drivers that's changing things and the AI piece among them, but now, so let's get to these scenarios. So you've got a very changed world, or one that's changing rapidly. So to wrap your head around it without going into the whole mechanics, you guys came up with 4 worlds, essentially, that are plausible given all these forces coming together. Do you want to just give a little sense of
so what do you do in an exercise like this? You get these people together and you say, okay, let's oversimplify things. Let's just pick 2 dimensions that really matter and see how different the world looks if you vary those 2 dimensions. And so you have 2 dimensions, each one has a high and a low state, you end up with 4 scenarios. And by the way, we got there from looking at 16 different fundamental uncertainties, everything from the effect of climate change to shifts in society. Anyway, the 2 dimensions we chose to focus on, one was the effect of automation, AI, on how much work was available. Would there be more work available, or the same amount to humans, yes, or less than today? The other was the changing nature of the relationship between a working person and whoever pays them. So would it still be primarily in the form of a job, as we've understood it, a full-time, long-term relationship between an employee and an employer? Or would it break up into whatever you want to call it, tasks, gigs, projects,
Independent work.
Well, and independent work is definitely a form of that. But of course, there are plenty of 1099s who work full-time for a single place. It might be for a project, but it's a little more complicated than that. But yes, roughly independent work. Let's call.
So that axis roughly is the axis we're kind of studying here. Is like going from the full-time world that was enshrined in the 50s, 60s, 70s to this atomized economy of independent work.
And there's definitely evidence that we are moving toward that atomized economy. Will it continue or not? Who knows whether the trend continues.
Seriously, so you don't feel that there's some kind of weightedness towards that? You really think that's up in the air?
I do. I think it's up in the air. I'll tell you the reason why.
Okay, that's interesting.
I think it's up in the air because lots of people don't like it. And so when people don't like it, they're going to seek out the alternative. I mean, if you don't have health care, and if you are feeling unprotected and you don't know where your next paycheck is going to come from, then you might not want to do that. And so I think it is very much still up in the air. The other thing is that in tech, we tend to look, we call the gig economy, we're really referring there to independent work that's enabled by online platforms, whether it's Upwork or TaskRabbit or pick your, Uber or Lyft, pick your thing. That's a tiny, tiny sliver of all independent work. A lot more independent work is people who are 1099s but full-time. They used to have a job and now they're a contractor. It could be that you're running your graphic design agency from home. And so the full picture of what independent work includes is much broader than what we imagine it to be in the technology industry. And so, yeah, the technology piece is going to grow, but it's still pretty small. Does it become big? Maybe. I mean, I don't know. It's kind of hard to say. We'll see. And I think it's up in the air.
Fascinating. And so, but it's essentially a social choice or a political choice or
a necessity. I mean, what's a choice? Like, one of the big questions in independent work is, do people do it because they have to or because they want to? Very difficult to get at that question, because what does that even mean? If I prefer it to my alternatives, do I prefer it because I had to, or do I prefer it because I wanted to? I don't know. It depends on, if you got fired from a job and then you became an independent worker and you liked it better later, does that mean you did it out of choice or out of necessity? So I think that question is very, very difficult to answer.
Yeah, not so much through the individual. I was just thinking, as a society, if we built systems that enabled a kind of robust economy that was secure and stable for independent workers, then that's a choice. Or if we don't do that, then it's maybe a political choice that's moving backwards.
So we have to decide. I mean, you and I have talked about the Treaty of Detroit before. We have an economic system in the United States that assumes a head of household, where the head of household, which was generally a man, provides for the household in terms of, well, if I have benefits, then my whole family has benefits. Number two, we assume that benefits and stability come from a relationship with an employer. One employer. And neither of those assumptions is very good in the modern world, let alone all the stuff about care and unpaid work that we talked about. So even in the world of paid work, neither of those assumptions is any good anymore. And so it's pretty clear that you need a new system. And in every one of these conversations about the future work, you end up somebody saying, oh, we need a new social contract. It's true. I think it's very true. That said, they then start to say, well, you need to supply income, but you also need to supply meaning, because people need meaning. And we decided, instead of blathering at conferences, to actually do some research on this. So we went and did a survey of American workers, and we asked them, what do you want from work? And we asked them about meaning. We asked them about making more money. We asked them about working with people they like, doing work they enjoy. Meaning, which is to say, we defined as doing work that is important to me, only ranked for people who made $150,000 a year or more. For everybody else making $150,000 a year or less, which is basically everybody, earning as stable and secure an income as possible was more important than earning more money, was more important than doing work that I find important. And so we have this instability, this fear of instability, which is compounded, by the way, by the rise in cost of healthcare, that if we don't solve that, I think it's going to be very hard to have a vital independent workforce, a vital entrepreneurial economy. You can't start a company if you're living in fear. I mean, certain people can, but as a person who funds entrepreneurs for a living, most of the entrepreneurs who I fund are not doing it out of fear. They have a stable set of alternatives, and they're doing it as a way to add more adventure risk to build something that they think needs to be built. And
could fall back on a job.
Yeah, probably. And by the way, it's also very dangerous for our economy if the only people who are starting new things are people who come from a background of relative privilege. Think about how narrow the range is of things that we'll get. I mean, people build things that come from their life experience, which is why it's horrible that the group of entrepreneurs that are funded is so heavily male. It's horrible. We don't talk about socioeconomic class, but the head of an accelerator once told me, all of our best entrepreneurs are rich. And that's terrifying. First of all, he happens to be wrong about his own entrepreneurs. But second, just the fact that that's a belief is terrifying.
Totally got it. Okay, so there's so much interesting stuff here to cover. But let's say, so out of these axes, just give us a little sense, without going into too much detail, about the kind of different visceral worlds that we might end up with.
If you imagine a world where there is still plenty of work available, where automation has not necessarily diminished the total amount of work available, and where work is still fundamentally jobs, then you imagine a world that feels in a lot of ways like worlds that we're used to. So that's one scenario. Then you got another scenario where you imagine that work is much less available. So we name these all after games, but it's still in the form of the job. We call that the king of the hill scenario, the king of the castle scenario.
Wait, which one? Which one?
Where you have less work available. So that's where you imagine jobs are this precious thing that's only available to a very small number of people, and we're dueling each other like crazy in order to get to that small number of available, attractive opportunities. We called a scenario where there's less work available. Where there's less work available. Let me start over. We called a scenario where work is more tasks, a jump rope economy, because you feel like you're doing little things and you just keep going. It's an endless treadmill and you just kind of keep going. And so in each of these scenarios, the worker will have different challenges to manage and the society will have different challenges to manage, but much more important than the differences between them, because now people often ask me, which one do you think is going to happen? Honestly, I don't know. And among our participants, we went through the 4 scenarios, and each one of the scenarios had somebody who said, oh, that's just the extension of today. So none of them is obvious. All 4 of them. And people would often say, oh, that one's the dystopia. And I promise you, for every scenario, there was somebody who thought it was utopia and somebody who thought it was a dystopia. And so one way of looking at that is very optimistic, which is say, no matter what happens, our society's choices are in our hands and we can make something great out of it. In order for that to happen, the common thread to me, if there was one word that people who are reading this, and you can find it online, or just thinking about it took away, the word is stability. Because we have had a narrative in American modern life where work is about opportunity. Bill Clinton, I think, was one of the most articulate advocates of that view, which is basically educate people, set them up fairly, and then as long as everybody's got an equal shot, it'll work out for the best. That's nonsense. It really is nonsense. In our modern American world, that has not happened. And when you see that people who start off with more advantages in life end up doing so much better, it just feels like opportunity is the wrong lens. Now, of course, it's true that people need opportunity, but before they can take advantage of that opportunity, they need stability. And when we talk about stability, historically in the US, the metaphor we've used is a safety net. And I think that's a terrible metaphor, because what that implies is you're mostly fine, occasionally you fall and you need to be caught. By the way, let's not forget the fact that what usually happens when you get caught in a net is you get ensnared and trapped, right, which is its own set of problems. I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. I think the right way of looking at it is that plenty of people in our modern society are starting out at the bottom. And unless we can get them up to a floor, to a pedestal, to a starting line that makes for a fundamentally fair society, of course they're going to look around them and be enraged. And by the way, that may be, I'm not a political expert, but that may be why we have the political situation we have in the United States, is a lot of people looking around and saying, hey, I thought the game was supposed to work a certain way, and it's nonsense. It doesn't work that way, and I'm mad. And that's justifiable. I mean, if you and I played a board game right now, and I told you the rules worked a certain way, and then they didn't work that way, and then, by the way, I said, by the way, you're stuck playing this board game for the rest of your life, you'd be pretty pissed off.
And you win.
And of course, as the guy changing the rules, I'd be, yeah, you'd be pissed off.
Totally.
And I think that's why I call it the great American disappointment about our changed expectations. And I think if we want to solve it, we have to change our language. I don't know what the new language needs to be, but I think we have to change our language to be about stability. And the reason to care about stability is because that's what's necessary for people to unleash their creativity, for people to unleash their entrepreneurial abilities, for people to lead fulfilled lives. Unless you're free from fear. I mean, it's one of the 4 freedoms, just back to classic, American leadership. I don't think the whole system works.
So that idea of stability is so different than the kind of what we lionize now. We lionize disruption, right, and invention and reinvention, right, and crazy change, new yep things, and so how do you shift the conversation back to stability?
It's a great question. I mean, I don't know, because I do think we lionize the Horatio Alger story, we lionize the great hero, and this is, and by the way, if you say I'm going to give somebody stability, many people's immediate reaction is, oh, they'll respond to that by being lazy. They'll sit at home and do nothing. They'll do opioids, I actually think it's just as likely to be the other way around, which is if they have no other alternatives, well, then opioids are the effect.
Right.
It might be around just acknowledging that when people feel safe, that's when they can be healthy, full, free members of the society. And I think that question that you just asked is the great question that we all have to grapple with.
How do we shift it? Because, there is this disruption, there is all this change for sure, and I don't see that changing too dramatically. But I like this idea of stability in the center of all that kind of disruption.
Well, and look, what I'm not saying is that we should have a stable society in the sense of being static, in the sense of not changing, in the sense of being slow. I'm saying that stability is an ingredient we have to add to get the stew to bubble. Because what I want a bubbling stew. I mean, I want creative ideas, I want happy people leading fulfilled lives, feeling the world is just, and ultimately discovering the great scientific discoveries, writing the great novels, sending rockets to Mars, whatever they need to do. And I think that we're missing an ingredient in the stew right now, and that's why it tastes bad.
So you're kind of pointing, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, but are you a supporter of a sense of a universal basic income or something that would provide
It's
that
fine to put
stability?
words in my mouth.
Okay.
I am actively involved in the Economic Security Project, which is a group that's looking at a universal basic income as the solution. I think there's a chance that it is the cheapest way to create a free society. That basically, if we want people to be full participants in the society, we need to get them up to a certain floor, and that it's the way to do it. Now, it raises a lot of questions. One of the many questions that it raises is, it's great if you have money, but if healthcare is really expensive and housing is really expensive, just cash doesn't fix that at a level that is sufficient. And so my basic view is it might be necessary, UBI, and we also have to address a lot of other issues that come with it, like health and housing and education and all kinds of other stuff.
Okay, but and then when for folks that are not as tuned into maybe even your version of UBI, just give people a kind of a bare bones idea of what are we talking about. We're talking on a monthly basis.
Right.
You get
No, so it's an old economic idea. It goes way back, but even Thomas Paine talked about it, and Martin Luther King talked about it. And the idea is,
and the right wing conservatives actually.
and
a version
of course,
it.
Milton. I mean, the libertarians, Milton Friedman, Friedrich, all those guys. The idea is hand somebody cash, enough cash to make their life work, and make it unconditional. So it's not you must spend it. Here's a stamp that you can only spend on the thing the government tells you to spend it on. Just you decide. You can make your own life work. And so universal means for everybody. Basic means enough to cover your basic needs. And income, cash. And there's a lot in there. One of the ideas that's in there is trust. Trust for the typical person. A cash grant to somebody means I'm going to let you decide. I'm not politician in Washington or wherever going to decide. You, the person, the recipient, decide. And that's a pretty powerful and new idea. Our system of social support in the United States has not been particularly trusting. And I think that's probably got to change. Universality, just the idea that it's for all of us. And then the question is, who is us? Where do we draw the boundaries of our society? And so I think it is one of the most compelling concepts for us to understand. And there's a good chance it's necessary to the solution.
You alluded to a couple of the quick pushbacks, but just just let's address them quickly. So there's this idea of meaning. Like people say, well, but people need more meaning. Are you saying that just gives a platform for people to find meaning and do something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we don't know, and that's why we have to test it and study it, and we have to study it in different ways. We have to study it in a data-driven way, and so there's people, Mayor Stockton is starting to give out money to residents. Let's see what happens. Mm-hmm. We have to study it in an imaginative way, which is why the Economic Security Project now has funded what will be the largest ever prize for an open submission short story contest for basically a science fiction short story to imagine a future that includes this, because we can't even imagine it yet. And so we have to do all these kinds of exploration, and it's obviously a huge concept not to be entered into lightly, but of the different policy ideas that are on the table, it's the only one I can think of that is big enough to potentially do lots of lifting in addressing these issues, and that we can and need to study further in order to put into practice.
The other one, because we're kind of getting to the point here where emerging from this awesome work that you did at this commission, but also your own thinking about this stuff, UBI is a solution that was. Give us some of the sense of where people are thinking about it. I know there's a portable benefits crew that started thinking, but maybe just give people a sense of how many interesting ideas are starting to swirl.
Oh, look, there's tons of stuff from portable benefits that you could implement that now. And in fact, if we had a different political makeup, it probably already would be law now. Portable
Just-
benefits
yeah,
is the
explain how-
concept that you should be able to take your benefits from one job to another, that it shouldn't be tied to an employer, and that would work very well for independent workers who could take it from one independent gig to another. The UK has had some ideas about different minimum wages for work that's stable versus for work that's unpredictable, which I think is a really intriguing idea. I'm not an expert.
So in other words, if you had a 1099 kind of job, a contract job, there'd be actually a premium paid to those people by law, because you have to pay your taxes, you have to pay your own thing.
That's right.
Whereas if you had a
That's right. It was an interesting idea.
Mm-hmm.
It's the way I think about it is, and I'm not a deep policy expert. I sling money for a living. I invest in startups. So I'm just thinking about what problems need to be solved. And I'm at the very, as a result of all this shift commission work, single biggest critique we got, which is valid, is we didn't tell people what to do about it.
Yeah.
And we didn't.
Yeah.
Our whole goal was to get people on the same page about what the questions even are.
Yeah.
And I've started my own path of trying to think about it. I see 3 areas that we need to address, which we've talked about. And I just want to summarize them. One is raising the floor for people so that they can participate economically and socially in the society. The second is figuring out what to do about all the kinds of work that the society needs done for which there's no willing payer. So call it the most important work if you want, call it unpaid work, but that's evidence of how important it is. And by the way, every time I hear a politician say, oh, but it's the dignity of having a job, I imagine a mom at home watching that on TV and thinking, well, what am I, chopped liver? Mm-hmm. And so that's the second piece, is this work society needs done. And the third piece, I don't know exactly the right word for this, but it's something like mass creativity, entrepreneurship, and that is where independent workers come in the sense that no matter under any scenario, working people are going to have to take, all people actually, but especially working people, are going to have to take more responsibility than ever before for their own economic life. They're not going to be able to set it and forget it, of get a job, do a good job there, and hope it all works out for the best. They're going to need to learn constantly throughout their entire life. They're going to need to learn different skills. How you graduate from school not knowing how to sell something to somebody, that's more important vocationally than a lot of things we learn in school. They're going to need to learn how to manage their own questions and insecurities and instabilities. It's a whole set of vocational skills. So in those 3 areas, it's raising the floor, it's figuring out what to do about all these forms of work that the society needs but the economy doesn't, or the paid economy doesn't, and then it's figuring out what to do about sort of creating mass entrepreneurship. And the only reason I hesitate on that word is I'm not talking about everybody creating Instagram. I'm not talking about creating a company necessarily. I'm talking about making your life for yourself, making your economic life for yourself, charting your own path. If we can figure those 3 things out, we have the answer. How do we get there? I'm prepared to spend the next 20 years at minimum of my life figuring it out.
I'm with you on that one. Awesome idea. Just give us, because we're coming towards the end of the conversation here, but let's give a little more texture to all 3 of those buckets.
Okay.
So when you say raising the floor, you're not just literally saying raise the minimum wage, although that's a thing, but you're saying education, childhood development. I mean, talk a little bit more about what
I'm
you say about
saying make it so that the default of the worst option that can happen to you, if you're unlucky, is you can still participate in the society. You still have enough food to eat, a place to sleep, you're going to get access to quality medical care, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. How exactly do you do it? Back to these focus groups that we did, we asked people, it's focus groups, so you'd have to test it more, but we asked people, what do you wish the government did for you that it doesn't do? Number 1 answer, every group, no objections, pay for health care. And by the way, this was in Ohio. This is not in some bleeding heart liberal place. This is Ohio, and people were saying things like, Canada has it, why can't we? And I was just my eyes were gonna pop out of my head hearing truck drivers in Ohio say stuff like that. And so, those are the components of raising the floor. The answer as far as how to handle unpaid but necessary forms of work, Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is my co-chair, runs New America in this commission. She's much deeper and more thoughtful on these issues and has been writing about them for a long time. It's a cultural change as much as anything else. And it's a change in what we choose to value as a society. We lionize dollars and GDP. And when we think about GDP, what is GDP? It's an arbitrary measure that a bunch of people with jobs, by the way, propertied white men with jobs, discussed with other propertied white men with jobs, and they said things to each other like, domestic labor is going to be too hard to count, meaning like parents, moms generally then raising kids at home, and moms generally now raising kids at home. Well, of course they thought it was too hard to count. That wasn't what they did for a living. They chose to count the kind of things they did for a living. And it's not exactly like GDP is an easy thing to count. I mean, we have an entire academic and policy, governmental infrastructure just trying to count the damn stuff. And so none of this is easy, but it's got to change. And exactly in what form, I wish I had a trench coat full of watches of all kinds of ideas, and I just don't. I think that's the question.
But I will say the only thing that's very hopeful about that space is I think with automation and AI getting rid of a lot of routine jobs, it's going to liberate people to do other things. And you could imagine the things that are underrepresented now are the human, emotional, many connected kind of jobs that might be revalued by the economy.
By definition. To me, part of the nobility of doing work is when it's necessary. So the second a computer or a machine can do something better than a person can, it almost by definition starts to become inhumane. The dishwasher comes in the house, and then the dishwasher's installed, and it frees up time for women to go into the workforce, among other things. And so there is this pattern of technology coming in and narrowing our definition, but then deepening our appreciation of what it means to be human. And that might be human-to-human contact, because that, by definition, is the only thing a machine can't do. And when we buy something that says handmade, we're paying for the fact that we know that that was not stitched by a machine. When that uncle who's aging says, I only want my nephew or my niece taking care of me, they're saying, I don't care if the service is the same. I want it to be not just a person, I want it to be this person. And so we might deepen our appreciation of all of that. I don't know what words to put to that yet, and I think that's one of the great puzzles that we got to figure out. I will also say there's a bias because of all of the challenges that technology brings to say, well, let's examine this. Before we rush whole hog into automating all this work, let's slow down and think about it. First of all, I think it's impossible to slow down. I think technology is going to do what technology wants. Title of What Technology Wants, a Kevin Kelly book, which I think is a fantastic read on understanding the independent force that is technology. And second, I think our intention should be the opposite. As a society, we should be trying to automate and invest in technology as rapidly as we possibly can. Now, I'm a technology investor, so it's easy for me to say that. But if it's possible that we can get a human being out of needing to do something, shouldn't we? And if you think about the history of our country, we have grown fastest at the times when we've invested in growth industries, when the country has made an intentional decision. And obviously, post-World War II is a great relatively recent example of that. I can't think of a better growth industry than AI. And if you believe that, then our government should be investing way more than the $1 billion a year that the Obama administration found at the end of the last term the federal government is investing in AI. There are plenty of governments around the world who are not having qualms about this and are investing very heavily. And if we want to be a healthy, vibrant society, we probably need to as well.
And your final third category, which we didn't quite elaborate on, but just a few thoughts on that, this more entrepreneurial spirit. I know in other places you've mentioned how our educational system sucks about doing that. But any thoughts on how we'd revitalize that kind of thinking?
We've built an educational system that's designed for training people to be participants in organizations. Go get a job. Join an organization, be part of an institution, and thrive. Figure out what you've been asked to do it well, get a pat on the head, grade. The difference between a grade in school and a performance review is not that big. And by the way, entrepreneurs, they don't have performance reviews in quite the same way. The market just tells them. They're not looking for the approval of somebody to pat them on the head. And so I think that entrepreneurship, and when I say that, I don't just mean starting tech companies or even starting companies. I'm talking about somebody who writes a novel, somebody who makes something that is meaningful for them. So let's just broaden the definition for a second. That kind of entrepreneurship, it's a trade. It's a trade. My dad was an architect. It's a trade in the same way that architecture is a trade. It has principles, it has practices. Yeah, you can design a home that just works, and you can be a fantastic artist who is, Lord Foster, who just designed this most sustainable building in the world for Bloomberg in London. But it's still it's a vocation. It's a trade, and it has tradecraft. And we as a society are only just now starting to recognize that and say, oh, maybe the trait of teaching people to decide on their priorities for themselves, like figuring out what you want to do with your life, is a skill that can be practiced. It's not just something that you get automatically handed to you. Making economic and just opportunity generally for yourself, knowing the skills that come with that, skills like selling, skills like self-promotion, hopefully in a way that's consistent with people's personalities. But there's all these vocational skills that come with learning to do this that we're only at the very beginning of recognizing their importance. I'll give you an example of a surprising one. You were talking about human empathy. I think it's so essential in anything creative. And my kids have an area, like a practice of learning at school, of social and emotional learning. So they learn stuff about this as if it's a class. It is a class. And they say things to me where I'm like, whoa, how did you know that? That's amazing. I'm 40, I barely figured that out. And I think they're gonna look at us and say, it's almost like we went to school and we didn't learn math. It's just so basic to how you understand yourself. And I think it's both basic to your growth as a human being, but also vocationally important to the act of entrepreneurship and creation. So that's kind of how I see that.
Wow. Well, I think that is a good place to stop. We could probably go for another
I'll be going on it
I'm amazed
for 20 more years.
I'm actually amazed how we did actually pack in as how much we did in 60 minutes here. But really fantastic having this conversation
Thank
with
you
you.
for inviting me.
A lot of great ideas. It definitely adds to our pool of new interesting insights. And thanks a ton for being with us.
Yeah, thank you.